I ask your best leaders team to rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, would every person give roughly the same number, or would half the room say 9 and the other half say 4, depending on which version of the leader showed up in their last meeting? Because that gap, the one between the leader people describe in a talent review and the leader people actually experience week to week, is where I want to spend the next few minutes. It's expensive, it's almost never measured, and I've watched it quietly wreck teams that on paper looked stacked with talent. I have sat with leadership teams who were convinced their problem was talent diversity. Look at this VP, they would say, and look at how she handled the client blow-up last quarter. She's brilliant under fire. And I would ask a different question. How is she on an ordinary Tuesday? Mid-pressure, when nobody's watching? Why? Well, because that's usually when the room was quiet. Because the honest answer depends on the day. That dependency is the whole episode. Institutions don't run on someone's best moment. They run on the pattern. And in the Norwyn Steady Leadership Framework, the domain that governs that pattern sits in self-steadiness, which is what we call the true north. It is the disciplined capacity to establish, hold, and restore your own steadiness under pressure, so your judgment and behavior stay intentional instead of reactive. It's positioned first in the framework for a reason. Everything downstream, how you read a room, how you orient, how you decide, inherits whatever internal state you bring into the moment. Most leaders treat steadiness as a fixed trait. You either have the temperament or you don't. The framework, in contrast, treats it as a governed process, something you can actually build, which is a far more useful way to think about it if you're the one responsible for developing the next generation of leaders. Here's where it gets specific, and this is pulled straight from the behavioral research underneath the framework. There's a documented pattern called state transmission failure, which is where a leader's internal strain leaks outward and destabilizes tone, pace, and demeanor across the whole group, whether or not the leader ever raises the voice. Its direct opposite is presence regulation, which is where the leader's tone and pace stay governed enough that the people around them experience steadiness instead of agitation. Same person, same pressure, yet a wildly different signal to the room. And there's a related pattern worth naming because it fools people, including the leaders themselves. It is called the confidence theater, which is where someone performs calm with force and volume while internally they are anything but governed. It looks like strength in the moment, but it costs trust the moment it cracks. And the people watching almost always know the difference between governed and performed, even when they can't articulate why something felt off. There is a companion piece worth naming too, because it shows up constantly in senior teams and rarely gets called by its name. It's emotional containment without suppression, which is not the same thing as staying calm. It means the leader still feels the frustration, the fear, the urgency, but contains it enough to remain governable, instead of pretending it is there. Leaders who confuse suppression with regulation tend to look composed right up until the moment they don't. And when that break happens, it tends to happen loudly. in front of the exact people who least expected to see it. The research outside our own doctrine backs this up more bluntly than I expected when I went looking. A study out of Northwestern Kellogg School found that leader emotional unpredictability drives intra-team power struggles that directly erode task performance, especially on teams that aren't tightly independent, which describes a lot of modern knowledge work. Separately, a 2025 study in the Journal of Business Ethics built an actual measure of perceived leader inconsistency and found something worth sitting with. Variability itself isn't what damages people. Flexible, responsive leadership is fine. What predicts stress, uncertainty, and emotional exhaustion is unpredictability. Not knowing which version of the leader you are going to get. And Gallup's own research puts a number on where that ends up. Roughly half of employees say they have left a job at some point specifically to get away from a manager. That's not a soft skills statistic. That's half your voluntary attrition budget sitting on a line item nobody labels correctly. Let me tell you about a leader I work with, because this is where the idea gets real. The leader is a genuinely brilliant strategist. In a crisis, in front of a client, extraordinary. Calm, precise, commanding. But the team dreaded ordinary Monday check-ins because a missed deadline or something minor could trigger a reaction wildly enough out of proportion to the stakes. It also observed that the team had built an entire informal operating system around it, pre-briefing each other before meetings, timing hard conversations for a good day, keeping a softened version of bad news ready in case the direct version triggered a spiral. Those behaviors were pure overhead, invisible and completely real. That's the economic framing that gets missed. Variability doesn't just cost the variable leader something. It taxes everyone downstream. Every person interpreting which version of the leader they are getting today is spending bandwidth on translation instead of actual work. Every quietly scheduled meeting is hidden management overhead nobody tracks. That's coordination cost. And it compounds across a team faster than most people assume. Ask operations leaders to quietly total the hours their teams spend managing the mood of leadership in a given month. And most have never been asked the question, which tells you everything about how invisible this line item really is. There is a second pattern in the corpus that explains why this survives so long inside organizations, and it's called pattern blind recurrence, which is where a leader experiences the same weak moment over and over, but treats each one as new and unrelated instead of as a pattern worth correcting. Beware, insight alone doesn't fix this. Plenty of leaders can describe their own volatility with accuracy in a coaching session and still be powerless to interrupt it on a Tuesday afternoon when a vendor misses a deadline. Without the corrective loop, self-awareness is just an accurate diagnosis with no treatment attached. Watch what happens on a team managing that pattern for 18 months. At first, people flag it carefully. When nothing changes, they stop flagging and start adapting instead, because adaptation feels more productive than complaining into a void. From the outside, that adaptation looks well like a well-run team with good instincts. But what it actually is a team that has learned to route around a structural weakness rather than name it. So eventually the routing becomes invisible even to the team itself. Nobody remembers a time when meetings weren't pre-briefed. That is the moment variability stops being an incident and becomes culture. And culture is far more expensive to unwind than the original pattern ever was. One clarification before we close, because this gets misheard. I am not describing leaders who need to be flat or unemotional. Composure isn't the absence of feeling. It is a disciplined relationship to it, where emotion still informs without commanding. A leader who shows zero signal at all isn't steady. They are just disengaged. And that creates its own unreliability. What I'm describing is narrower and harder. Having the bad Tuesday internally without the team absorbing the blast radius of it. I invite you to try to spot this on your own team. Don't start by asking about outbursts, because most of this is subtler than any story anyone will volunteer. Instead, ask them how meetings actually get scheduled, whether there is an unspoken sense of which days to avoid, ask them how bad news travel upward, whether it arrives directly or arrives pre-softened, tested on someone safer first. Ask them what happens in the 30 minutes before that person walks into the room. If there's a ritual of calibrating everyone for whichever version might show up. You found your answer, and you found it without a single formal complaint ever being filed. So here's what I would leave you with. Every performance review in your company probably asks how a leader performs on their best day. Almost none of them ask what it cost the people around that leader on an ordinary one. If you actually did the math right now, across the leaders you would call your strongest, whose name would move? And are you ready for what that tells you about who you've really been rewarding? Think about that. See you next time.